Hi everyone, welcome to another G News podcast. Today we are joined by Melanie Nelson, who is the founder of the well-known Weaving Our Worlds podcast that seeks to bring understanding between Pākehā and Māori. Melanie also has a new podcast named Coherent and is also a licensed translator and interpreter who has done a huge amount of mahi on the Regulatory Standards Bill. Melanie has a background working within government in conservation management, treaty relationships and policy, and outside government as a consultant. Hi, Melanie, and welcome to the show.
Kia ora, Gerard. Thanks for having me along. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, welcome. Melanie, you were one of the chosen who delivered an oral submission this week on the Regulatory Standards Bill. And you also wrote a very comprehensive written submission, which asked hundreds of questions across many sectors. You've interviewed many experts, and you've been involved in the Regulatory Standards Bill since December. Although, in fact, I think you alerted us all to the Regulatory Standards Bill being introduced in November 2024. I think it was the 19th of November, which was the same day as the hikoi arrived in Wellington. Could you tell us all a bit about how you got started on this work?
Yeah, sure. I think my first article on the RSB, which alerted people, came out in December, but it was referencing back that it had been launched for consultation on the same day as the hikoi arrived in November. So yeah, my transition into this work has been unexpected and interesting. My career in recent years has been focused on strategic cross-cultural relationships, treaty education and consultancy on the application of the treaty principles, especially in conservation and environment, and as a translator. And so that was, fully consuming my work time, and I was really enjoying that work, but it unexpectedly evaporated when this government came into power. And so early in 2024, I hadn't realised how much they had pulled back on translation work and treaty work and those sorts of things, and the ripple effects that was having throughout that industry. And so I had some time available February last year and thought, I'll have a look at this treaty principles bill that they're putting forward, because I know quite a bit about the treaty principles, and these ones look not very odd. They don't look like the treaty principles. In fact, they don't really look like the treaty at all. But I thought, well, I'll try and understand how they've derived these from the treaty, giving them the benefit of the doubt and, seeing how they come out of the treaty. So I spent actually some weeks going through the treaty in both languages as a licensed translator. I could also look at it in te reo in a quite complex way, and looking at the proposed principles that ACT was putting forward for inclusion in the government's treaty principles bill. And it just got more and more confusing and concerning, because no matter how much I tried, I could not find their principles in the treaty, and could see how they were arguing that they were there, but it was through cherry picking specific partial phrases, taking them out of context, both linguistic and historical, and imposing different meanings on them out of context. And that's where those principles had come from. And so I sort of reached that point and thought, well, that's interesting. I should publish about that. And then my mind kind of goes, well, you know how the treaty principles are used. So what would happen if these principles were used in the place of the actual treaty principles to interpret our laws, for example? And I have a background in conservation, and so I know the Conservation Act really well, and I know that the treaty principles apply to the 20 or so legislations that are listed on Schedule 1 of the Conservation Act, and I used to work in the space of the application of those principles. So essentially the treaty principles that ACT was putting forward were not derived from the treaty in any meaningful sense, and were in fact a libertarian set of principles and ideals. And if you put them in the place of the actual treaty principles and interpreted the Conservation Act through those ideals, it would take you away from having, say, engagement with Māori, protection of kaitiakitanga, protection of taonga, those sorts of things that emerge from the treaty principles, and it would place you as having to read the Conservation Act to give effect to, the formal equality, so no particular rights given to Māori or conservation groups, environmental groups, for example, having to prioritise corporate rights and interests over the actual purpose of conservation and those sorts of things. And so that took me on this interesting journey of what would that do to apply all of our laws through that lens. And this idea didn't really get picked up. It was very hard, near impossible to publish it, and eventually Nick Rockwell published this part of the analysis on his Substack. But that's sort of the long answer to how I got into this work with the RSB, because all of last year I was listening to ACT's narrative and rhetoric around the Treaty Principles Bill, being one of the few people that knew that they were actually talking libertarian language where these terms have different meanings. So fundamental human rights, as they have in the Treaty Principles Bill, to libertarians, that doesn't mean human rights as we understand it. It means property and individual rights. And other key phrases in there, the rule of law, they have a very narrowed down interpretation, which is also about property rights. And so listening to David Seymour, particularly last year, his narrative and explanations of the Treaty Principles Bill were very consistent with my understanding of the libertarian interpretations of those principles. And so when the Treaty Principles Bill came out and was exposed, its full text, I was very surprised to see there weren't definitions of these key terms there, because I knew that he was intending these libertarian definitions, but given that they're not widely understood, how would that be enforced, given that there were no definitions in the bill? And so my instincts told me that material for the definitions must be somewhere else, because he was so clearly intending these particular meanings, which I think make no sense to most people, because they're like, but that's not what equality is. Equality is about fairness, whereas by equality he means you shouldn't take people's income in the form of taxes to redistribute to others, for example. So yeah, I went on a bit of a search while everyone else was busy writing submissions or getting ready to write submissions on the Treaty Principles Bill, and went, where are these definitions? Because they must be somewhere. I'm sure they haven't left it to chance that the courts would favour their interpretation of these principles. So one of the places I looked was the Coalition Agreement, and I saw this thing called the Regulatory Standards Act, which had agreed to be passed. And I thought, that sounds really boring. I don't even want to look at that, but I should. And so I went and looked at this. What I could find was the Regulatory Standards Bill 2021 initially, and read that and went, oh, this is where the interpretations are, because in that Regulatory Standards Bill was a set of libertarian principles, and there was also a clause in there, which is not in the current bill, but the clause in there said that these principles should be used to interpret all other legislation where there is, doubt about the meaning, or there's two meanings that could be read in. And so that was how those treaty principles would be given their interpretation as libertarian principles, given that the RSB was, they knew it would be enacted, but at that point no one else much knew about it. So yeah, that's how I discovered the RSB.
That's an amazing story, that it all kind of dovetails completely into the conversations that we've been recently having this week about regulatory standards. Melanie, you were really impressive, actually, I thought, in your submission, and one of the things that came out in the submissions was legal uncertainty and long-term constitutional instability. You talked about a legal minefield in the statute books being introduced by the Regulatory Standards Board bill, which shifts the centre of gravity and creates ongoing legal ambiguity. Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about that shift in gravity and the legal ambiguity that the Regulatory Standards Bill will bring?
Yeah, sure. Good question, and thank you. Yeah, so one of the, I think, most important points here is that currently through the legislation guidelines that the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee maintain, and that's our gold standard for good lawmaking in this country, those guidelines include a very broad range of values. And so the shift of gravity is that it would shift away from lawmakers considering this broader range of values and giving balance and weight to them all in a similar sort of way. And it takes essentially some of the principles out of there and puts them in a statute and changes some of them to a degree, makes some stronger, takes the rule of law and narrows it down to a specific libertarian range, and we might come back to that. But it takes a subset of those principles, puts them in a statute, giving them a whole lot of processes and hopes that government has to look at these in a very strong way through the lawmaking process. And so it shifts that centre of gravity away from everyone's interests and values, which are in the legislation guidelines, and emphasises in isolation from those a specific subset. And, as it's been said, these are not binding, and government, of course, can still consider all the other values and can enact laws which give effect to them, but not these. But there's a whole lot of soft power at play in this bill, which will make that much, much more difficult for government. And that, I believe, is the intention, to make it much more difficult to legislate in the public interest or to uphold te tiriti or for the environment, for example. So that's sort of what I mean by shifting the centre of gravity away from what we know to a regime which favours the wealthy and those who have land and property and corporate interests. And to the part of your question about the uncertainty it would create, I think this is profound, and I think it hasn't had sufficient attention yet, but there's a whole lot of things that would happen here. So we have this set of principles that are put in this bill and they're not defined. And so there's a huge range of potential definitions. So either it would create a lot of, court action to try and understand what the definitions are, but there's a clause in here which says the bill doesn't create or confer legal rights. And Sir Geoffrey Palmer, when I interviewed him on Coherent, said that actually the intention of that clause is to prevent the court from being the interpreter and to leave that with others. And so what happens is the bill says that the Minister for Regulation, who's currently David Seymour, and the Attorney General will issue guidance on the interpretation and application of those principles. And so it's putting huge power in his hands to interpret them, a role that, with the separation of powers, should be with the court, where it can be, independently done and there can be appeals and things like that. And so, while we don't know how he will interpret them, because it perhaps hasn't been done yet, I think we can assume from what we've seen that it will be in a libertarian bent of what they mean and in favour of the ACT Party's values and ideals. So we have the uncertainty about how they'll be interpreted, and that doesn't seem to be any restrictions on the minister changing how they're interpreted over time either, so that in itself could create uncertainty. The unelected board will issue formal judgments and recommendations, and they might take it in a particular direction, which creates more uncertainty. Um, and yeah, it shifts away from our constitutional foundations and the public will and the public good, which we're used to being a core part. So that's part of that shifting of gravity. And it really seems that it would invite a lot of litigation and delay, particularly from vested interests. And especially once these principles are incorporated into more and more legislation, because that's the intent. And once they're in other legislation, then they will be enforceable in law. Um, and really, like, I think the key point about the uncertainty, which also hasn't had sufficient attention, is that the RSB sets a process and a requirement that nearly all of our laws and much of our regulations as well, our secondary legislation, will be reviewed under the Regulatory Standards Bill. And then it will either be amended to bring it into consistency with these principles. And given it was made under an entirely different set of values, I'd expect most of our laws to be inconsistent with one or more of these principles. And if it's not amended, the government will have to publicly justify keeping laws which are inconsistent with the rules of making responsible regulations. So why are they being irresponsible in keeping these? So essentially, our entire legal system is up for review and change in the coming decade or two. And that's just insane amounts of instability and uncertainty for everybody. And that's not good for government. It's not good for businesses. It's not good for communities that we don't know what our laws will be in a few years' time. They could be completely upended. So, yeah, that's sort of a lot of the thinking around that.
That's great. You wrote in your submission that the Regulatory Standards Bill is an attempt to change or reduce the role of government and to change the values of New Zealanders as a society. And we talked about intent there. That's David Seymour's intent. Could you talk, a little bit more about how that would actually happen?
Yeah, so so David Seymour has said that the intention is to create culture change over decades. And I think that we're getting quite hung up on, is it legally enforceable or is it not? Can companies sue directly because of the RSB or not? And while that's important, I don't actually think that's the main point here. And, this is my thinking's aligned with by experts in law, such as Professor Dean Knight and others. And so Eddie Clark, for example, I think that what this is about is actually what's called soft power. And there are many layers in this bill that will influence what happens within government and including in the public service, right from the very get-go of an idea, long before it reaches being in legislation or even the possibility of court action or whatever. And the issue here is that there's several things which come together to make it very, very difficult for government to do things which don't align with these principles or basically don't align with what the ACT Party wants. So there's the need to do quite complex assessments of proposed legislation for assessment against the consistency with the principles. And that in itself is going to be a huge amount of time and bureaucracy taken up just doing that. There's a requirement to engage at a very early stage with the Ministry for Regulation. And so for officials to be coming up with ideas, they're going to start going to each other, oh, but that might be inconsistent, that might be irresponsible. Oh, we'd have to then spend 6 months working on this assessment and we don't have time because we'd have to drop off this other work. So we'd better not even start looking at that idea. And so part of it will be that good ideas will probably get stifled before they even make it to the table. But then once they, if they do make it to the table and they're inconsistent with these principles, there's multiple layers of harassment and interference. And so there's the assessment process, and then having to publicly make a declaration that your proposal is inconsistent with responsible regulation principles. There's the board, and so the Regulatory Standards Board will be taking complaints from the public that propose new or existing legislation is inconsistent with one or more of these principles. So if it looks after the public good rather than a private interest and liberty, essentially, it could be deemed to be inconsistent. So there'll be the harassment factor through the board, which can also initiate its own inquiries, or the Minister for Regulation can initiate inquiries. So there'll be this sort of public information criticising what the government is doing, or criticising laws that exist to look after the public good. And there'll be a whole lot of kind of political backlash that will likely whip up. It's a platform for media, and the Minister for Regulation and the ACT Party will be able to use it to say, look, they're being irresponsible. The board says so, the ministry says so, they said so themselves in their declaration. They shouldn't be doing this thing. And, the comeback we get is, oh, but Parliament's still sovereign, it can still do the thing. And it can, but you sort of start to see how politically infeasible it might be, and that over time, that those shifts within how the public service work, and within these political layers of soft power and the force that the bill has, that the government will just either not to be able to afford the time and resources to jump through all the hoops to do lots of things in the public interest, so it might reduce how much they do, or it might actually be that, the parties that do that and keep getting labelled irresponsible get less share of the vote, and adjust their behaviour so they're not labelled irresponsible and don't get that backlash. And like I say, I think it will also change in the minds of the public that, oh, it's irresponsible to pass legislation that looks to uphold Te Tiriti or looks after the environment. And so, while some people will never change their minds, there's a certain portion, and I think reasonably significant, that over time will be swayed by those repeated messages, because that's how our brains work, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. There's a list of ACT preferred principles in the Regulatory Standards Bill, and these include, but are not limited to, preferentially selected aspects of the rule of law, formal equal treatment before the law, a narrow focus on cost-benefit analysis, property rights supremacy and protection against regulatory takings, individual focus, and limiting government discretion. Now, perhaps we could step through some of these and talk about them, what they actually really mean, just so that the audience can kind of get their head around what these principles are a bit more.
Yeah.
So perhaps we could talk about this preferentially selected aspects of the rule of law.
Yeah, let's have a look at that. So this is one of the things that I find frustrating about, the debates around the Regulatory Standards Bill, is a lot of the media coverage has said, oh, some of these principles, are quite common, very broadly accepted, such as the rule of law, which of course there's a heading in here under the rule of law. But it says the importance of maintaining consistency with the following aspects of the rule of law. And it takes 6 or 5 specific aspects of the rule of law and puts them in the bill. But it actually misses out several. And you've got to be kind of like geeky or, a lawyer to think about this and to realise that there's some things missing. And this is actually a narrowed down libertarian version of the rule of law. And by putting this in a statute, it's likely to affect not only this particular statute, but potentially how the rule of law gets applied and interpreted in other contexts as well. So The things that are included here are things like the law being clear and accessible, not adversely affecting rights or liberties, etc., retrospectively, formal equality of every person is equal before the law, there should be an independent, impartial judiciary, and that issues should be resolved by the application of law rather than the exercise of administrative discretion. I think that last one hasn't had that much attention, but it's quite important. It's sort of saying things should happen in court or through black and white application of the law rather than the government getting to weigh things up with respect to different circumstances, which I think is very concerning because there's a lot of discretion is needed to be fair and make good decisions in a specific context. But the aspects of the rule of law that are missing are things like fairness and equity, a right to natural justice, the accountability of government. So this says every person is equal before the law, but it actually seems to be leaving out the government because the government's not a person. It really, elevates legal certainty and individual liberty, but some of those things I mentioned, including protection of the vulnerable, tikanga, and the responsibility of government to act in the collective interest, these things are all not listed there. And so while the rule of law is there, it's a narrowed down version. And I think we see this sort of approach repeated throughout this law, or proposed law, this bill, things which look kind of okay when you glance at them and read them, but unless you're quite a deep expert, and I think also can read how some of the clauses would interact with some of the other clauses, like I think we're missing some of the really important things which are very subtly but very clearly being proposed or done here. And so that's perhaps the main things to say about the rule of law. That focus on formal equality is really, minimizing or ignoring the needs of different minoritized groups such as disabled people or the elderly or Indigenous rights, etc. So
let's talk about property rights and the supremacy of property rights and protection against regulatory takings. This has been elevated in there.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit more about how that seems to have inserted itself above everything?
Yeah. So this is really, I think, the RSB attempts to elevate individual property rights, and people need to remember that whenever we're talking about individuals or persons in New Zealand law, we include corporations. And so there's a very, very strong protection here for property rights, and that legislation shouldn't take or impair property unless there's good justification for it. Fair compensation is provided to the owner, and that compensation, to the extent practicable, is paid on behalf or by the people benefiting. And so this is known as regulatory takings, and it's a American developed concept developed by a lawyer called Richard Epstein, and he popularized and developed that concept. And it's really, I think, intended to make it prohibitively expensive for government to legislate in a way that impacts property rights for the public good. And while this, probably isn't directly enforceable through courts, if property is impaired, it sets up the expectation that government, if they're passing regulation or legislation that impacts property rights, which a lot does do, for good and for good reasons, that the people who own the property should be compensated. And so it's saying that when we make new laws or when we review all of our existing laws, where they impact private property rights, there should be compensation payable to those impacted. And so, you can kind of imagine that this would, like, I think Sir Geoffrey Palmer said there's just not enough money in Treasury to do that. Um, and obviously, the government could still choose to not put compensation into the law. Um, there would probably be some sorts of challenges either through the, harassment through the board or judicial review. Potentially state investor disputes could be internationally, which are not in the courts, could be bolstered through the government not putting in regulatory takings compensation. So there's a whole lot of ways it's intended to pressure and could have some legal repercussions as well. And really, it sets up a framework which really encourages that is the norm for what will be in our future laws and in our existing laws once they're reviewed. And the government's already said they will be putting regulatory takings provisions in the RMA replacement. So it's not just, it's not just there with no intention for it to be implemented, I think is fair to say.
The chilling effect of all of this, could you talk about how that the Regulatory Standards Bill may have a chilling effect on responsible lawmaking with regard to, say, public health or environmental protections, treaty obligations, or social services? How maybe some examples of how the chilling effect might actually happen?
Yeah. So there's a few layers, I think, to the chilling effect. And one is from what we talked about with the harassment factor and the political pressure and soft power that's embedded throughout the bill, that could stop policies even making it to the table or could change the policies at an early stage to look more after private interest than public good. And then I think the regulatory takings concept, and that as part of responsible legislation that should be in a law, that will also have a chilling effect because government will be thinking, well, what are the costs? What should we be paying in compensation if we protect this wetland on private property or if we declare this heritage site? And so the costs will probably become more of a consideration than they have been, and I'm sure that's part of the intention. And so the chilling effect could be that governments are afraid of the compensation claims or liability, and we'll see exactly how that does play out in the courts. There's mixed legal opinions about that, but there are other non-court processes where it could be, very costly politically to a party or a government to not provide the compensation because those well-resourced who want it will have both the resources to make a big fuss about it and these built-in mechanisms such as the board to, get a lot of public information backing up their claims as well. So if we look at, say, environmental protection, you think about, and this is one that's proposed for the RMA, you think about protecting a special ecosystem or a heritage site on private land. So it might say, well, that, that 10% of your land actually needs to be fenced off to look after this site. And I think the idea is that that landowner would then be entitled to compensation for the lost value of their land. If it was worth $5 million, maybe they get $500,000 for the 10% that's locked up or whatever. And so, we currently have compensation through the Public Works Act for taking of property, but this is about impairment. So that's, say, an ecological example. And environmentally, we're looking at, the Ministry for the Environment said in their feedback to the to Cabinet on the proposal that it looks essentially like the RSB would reverse the polluter pays principle, and that essentially means that polluters would be paid. So if you don't want them to pump their pollution into the river, which is a public good and not a reason to impair their property, it's not justified reason under the RSB because the public good isn't on the list of reasons, nor is the environment, then if they're going to not do that, it's impacting their profitability. They have to do something probably more expensive with it. And so they could expect to be entitled to compensation and could, activate these processes to pressure the government to do that. Yeah, and in public health, say, think about, putting the example that's commonly talked about is because this is a real example that has happened, where cigarette companies in Australia where the government proposed to have plainclothes packaging, and so the company in that situation was like, that's an impact on our property rights, which includes our label, it's intellectual property. And I think they moved their headquarters to another country, which meant that they could then do an international investor dispute process with the Australian government based on this regulatory taking. And I don't think that they eventually won that, but the issue here is that they got to keep using their branding for 10 or 15 years or whatever it was while that dispute was in process, and tied up a huge amount of time and money from the government in defending and engaging in it. So yeah, some real kind of practical examples of some of the ways that might play out.
Fantastic. You wrote in your written submission that the coalition agreement does not support this specific bill. Could you talk about that and what that means?
Yeah, I think this is really important to understand because the coalition agreement between the National Party and ACT Party states to legislate to improve the quality of regulation, ensuring that regulatory decisions are based on principles of good lawmaking and economic efficiency by passing the Regulatory Standards Act as soon as practicable. And there was no appendix of any Regulatory Standards Act, or strange that it says Act rather than Bill, given it hadn't passed. Yeah, but there was no appendix. And so it seems to be a high level statement of intent rather than an endorsement of the detailed contents of the current bill we have before us. And of course, the ACT Party probably had in their head that it'll be whatever bill they want to pass, but it didn't say Regulatory Standards Bill 2021, which it could have done because that was an actual bill. And indeed, the bill we have before us has changed quite a bit since the 2021 bill. And the bill we have now hadn't been written at the time of the coalition agreement. So, it's a bit much to think the coalition parties in New Zealand first signed off on this, that they would have been agreeing to pass a bill with any content that the ACT Party wanted. And so I have heard that New Zealand first speaking to this and saying, well, there are a couple of caveats in here that we need to, check it's based on good lawmaking, or I think they said good governance, which is similar, and economic efficiency. And that sure would pass a Regulatory Standards Act, but we kind of committed to this one that we hadn't even seen. And so, the question then becomes, well, what is good lawmaking and what is economic efficiency? And there's oodles. You've probably heard lots of good arguments being put to the select committee that these principles are by no means principles of good lawmaking. They're ACT Party principles, a subset of things you would consider in good lawmaking, and there's lots of good arguments too about this is not economic efficiency, that what is proposed, and likewise that the actual the process of this hasn't been good lawmaking either. So Another thing which I think is useful to note from the coalition agreement, and I've got an article out in eTangata this morning on this actually, is that the coalition agreement with New Zealand First and National agrees to uphold treaty settlements. There's a clear commitment in there to that. Um, and given that many of those treaty settlements explicitly affirm a new relationship between the Crown and iwi based on te tiriti o Waitangi, or the treaty principles, and that that is totally absent from the RSB, that the Regulatory Standards Bill in its current form risks undermining that legislative commitment to a new relationship based in te tiriti. And these are not just like fluffy agreements, they're laws, and these things are written in the laws. Yeah, and furthermore, there's a lot of other aspects of treaty settlements that the RSB would affect, and they're detailed in that article if people are interested. And several submissions have focused on this because the RSB excludes treaty settlement legislation, but there are many aspects of treaty settlements which are in other laws which will be subject to review, or were in, for example, deeds of settlement, which are not legislation. And also, some of the submissions noted that iwi are required and limited by the Crown to negotiate their settlements within the existing legal framework. So they're not repeating rights or interests that are given effect through other laws because they were told they're already in that RMA or in this law. So if that whole legal framework is to be reviewed and changed, then the assumptions that were, compulsorily enforced through negotiations, that those laws are there, so you don't need to talk about that stuff in your settlement. That whole assumption is undermined.
David Seymour actually mentioned to the press, can you give me an example, he said, of where the treaty being not included would lead to some kind of outcome that's not as good. And for all New Zealanders, I think he said. So the example, it would be really good if the press could have answered that, but I hadn't seen anybody answer an example of, how leaving out the treaty somehow leaves people worse off. That's David Seymour's line anyway, that all New Zealanders aren't going to be affected by this. So
yeah, he's got a very clever way with words. And I think there's a few things here. Firstly, the treaty, it's not his choice to say I should only include the treaty if it does something for his definition of all New Zealanders. Like, that's not the point. The treaty is an agreement, and it's a treaty, and it's part of our constitution. It's our founding document. So he's assuming a right to manipulate how we think about its importance, and it should only be important if this, amorphous concept of all New Zealanders are going to benefit from it. So firstly, it's not optional in that way, and he's narrowing how we should think about whether or not the treaty should be part of what we consider in our lawmaking. Like, the fact is that there's really significant sections in the legislation guidelines about how to consider te tiriti and the treaty principles in our lawmaking process. So that is all being left out of the RSB and would be therefore outside of the principles of responsible regulation. And second is, what does he mean by everybody or all people in New Zealand? And I think it's kind of easy to think that he means the public good as we think of it, or generally benefiting New Zealanders. So, for example, you could easily point to clear ways in which the treaty looks after the environment and protects us from corporate exploitation across the conservation state, for example. I think the treaty has a huge role there, and is, a lot of what stands in the way to real extreme environmental degradation in New Zealand. And so I would consider that of benefit to all New Zealanders. But, um, I think he would find a way to say that's not benefit to all New Zealanders in the way he means all New Zealanders. And, libertarians tend to talk about all people, but they actually mean individuals, and that we're
Yeah.
just a random collection of individuals rather than having any common interest, for example, in having a healthy environment. So, yeah, there's always ways that he'll wiggle out of, you know, actually engaging
Yeah,
with any of the substance of what is being said. Yeah.
it's the old there's no society thing. There's
Mm.
been a lack of sector level preparation and advice around the regulatory standards, Bill. Could you talk to us about how most sectors may be affected by the RSB and the risk that the RSB could precipitate fast moving and broad reforms, which may be largely out of the control of the ministers of the day?
Yeah, well, one of the things that most interests me about the RSB is not the RSB itself, but what would its flow-on effects be when all of our laws are reviewed and should be brought into consistency with it. And so that takes you into like everywhere and every sector. And Jonathan Boston's termed this the everything bill. And so that's been a real big area of interest to me. So I was looking through the parliamentary written questions and I saw that the Green MP, Francisco Hernandez, had made a whole lot of written questions to ministers asking what advice they'd sought on the implications of the RSB for their portfolios. And it was really concerning to see that most ministers had not commissioned any substantial analysis or received any comprehensive advice. And the lack of that sort of portfolio specific scrutiny is really concerning because if they vote for this bill, they're signing off on a bill which their portfolio and the laws they are responsible for will be reviewed under it and with a lot of pressure to change to make them consistency with this narrow set of principles. And they haven't looked, as far as we can see, at how that would change the things they're responsible for and the flow-on effects throughout their departments. So, and or how that might constrain their ability to regulate things they want to do next year, for example, that are for the public interest. Um,
It's bizarre, isn't it? It's like
it's really
absolutely,
bizarre.
just
Yeah.
can fish out of water, have no idea, and they've signed up for this. Now, you
Yes.
mentioned earlier what's called Clause 24, and we hear Seymour talk a lot about that clause. And you
Mm.
wrote earlier this week, in the week, that Sir Geoffrey Palmer said that any lack of court enforceability is not a mitigating feature, it is a key source of its structural danger. And
Mm.
Palmer calls Clause 24 one of the bill's most troubling elements, warning that it breaches the separation of powers by limiting the court's ability to interpret its key provisions. Legislation that functions as law for some purposes but not for others, he argues, is constitutionally improper, and interpretation belongs to the courts, not ministers. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. So, when I interviewed Sir Geoffrey Palmer, he talked about this clause 24, and um, there was an article that came out in Newsroom, I think it was a couple of weeks ago now, saying that was by the one of the editors of Newsroom saying the RSB is a toothless tiger, given that this clause, which says it's
Right.
not enforceable in law, um, and with my knowledge of the RSB, I was like, that's just not the point. It's distracting us from actually what are the intended effects of the bill. It's not strictly about enforcing it in court, but we're used to seeing that as a key way of accountability. Whereas, as I mentioned, all these layers of soft power are how it's, going to really do its deep work. And Sir Geoffrey Palmer called it a depth charge put in the middle of Parliament that will cause interference over years and decades. So, yeah, Sir Geoffrey Palmer said that the enforceability is not a mitigating feature, and actually he sees it as a key source of its structural danger because he sees it as breaching the separation of powers by limiting the court's role in interpreting its key provisions. And of course, legislative interpretation is the role of the courts. And the RSB actually even says separately that the court's role in interpreting legislation should be retained. But Sir Geoffrey says that having this clause here could be an attempt to shield it from the courts interfering with how it should be interpreted, because all but one part of it don't confer rights that would be enforceable in court. The part that does still confer those rights is the information gathering powers given to the Minister for Regulation, which are extremely broad and almost unlimited, which some people have made submissions on. And if they're not complied with, they could be enforceable by contempt of law in the courts. So, so Geoffrey was explaining that interpretation should be with the courts, whereas that clause seems to leave a bit of a vacuum around interpretation. And then that interpretation is actually done by the Minister for Regulation through issuing the guidance on interpretation jointly with the Attorney General. And so it sort of leaves a lack of room for appeal or argument with the decisions on the interpretation, which are vested in a political minister and would be influenced probably to some degree by a politically appointed board. And Sir Geoffrey actually said that's too much executive power without the appropriate checks and balances, and it's paving a way that, could lead to authoritarianism. So he was very, very concerned about that.
That's great. You've produced a sector-based reflection tool that offers tailored, grounded questions around how the Regulatory Standards Bill could affect particular laws, practices or values. What are some of those questions that were the tool posed, and how might this tool be used?
Yeah, so a bunch of us who'd been thinking about the RSB all year and looking at what do these principles actually mean and how might they be applied, realised that actually the public needed some support to start thinking constructively and critically about this and what it might mean for their particular sector or area of interest. And so the real interesting questions, I think, are it's easy to look at the RSB and be like, oh, it seems a bit abstract and vague and we don't know actually what it means for me or what I care about. But when you start going, oh, what would it mean to review all the education legislation to align with these principles, or the conservation legislation, or the legislation that regulates internet and AI use, or whatever it is your interest is. And so, we decided to develop a tool that would ask reflective questions that people could explore in the area that they're interested in, to start considering what some of the implications might be, because it's all fine and well to say, oh, no one has to actually, these principles, the government doesn't have to do them, but clearly it's being progressed and has been pushed for 25 years with an idea that it would do something and they want it to do something. Otherwise, why would you? And so we wanted to help people be empowered to think about this themselves where they are experts, and there's no way, people like you and I can do all this thinking. And so it was really enabling people to get involved in the democratic process and have conversations within their workplaces or groups of friends or whatever. So I worked with Dr. Ryan Ward and some others to develop this, and it covers, I think, nearly 80 sectors. There's a whole lot of questions. You can just go click on the title of whatever it is you're interested in, and it takes you to one page that has 10 or 15 questions about that sector, and starts to go, well, if you applied this principle to this particular aspect, what might happen here, or would it lead to this? And um, so it's not giving people the answers, but it's giving them tools to
Yeah.
consider what it might do. Yeah.
Where would you find this? If somebody was listening and they thought, oh, I'd like to try that tool, how would they go about finding it?
Yeah, it's there's a tiny URL, and it's tinyurl.rsb tool. I can send you the link uh, to
Okay.
put to put in the notes if you
Yeah.
like.
Great. Okay. So we're coming sort of the end of our time. Um,
Yeah.
how
Oh,
would you sum up? How
here
would
it
you?
is,
Oh, you've got
Jared.
it.
I'll just give you a
You've
tool.
got it.
Yeah. https:// tinyurl.com/rsb tool.
Fabulous. Well, there you go, everybody. Get onto that tool and start asking questions. How would you sum up the regulatory standards bill so far?
Um, well, I guess my involvement started towards the end of last year, but after I'd sort of done some analysis and thinking about it, realized that it had been through three attempts previously, and there's a whole generation of interesting thinkers like Jonathan Boston and Jane Kelsey and Jeffrey Palmer and other people who've been, writing and opposing this through its previous iterations too. So in terms of I think it's very concerning it's come round for this fourth attempt, when I think in terms of the so far with its whole history, it also is very strongly linked back to the 1980s neoliberal reforms. In terms of this iteration, I think that the consultation was very quietly launched on the day of the hikoi, and it wasn't broadly advertised, and the extent of the significance of it wasn't clearly articulated, and still hasn't been by the government. And so it was fortunate that, I'd already been looking at it for some weeks before the consultation was announced, and then was about to publish something, but didn't know the consultation was about to happen. So then had to assess what had changed since the 2021 version, and, eventually could bring that to people's attention. So I feel like the fact that there were then 23,000 submissions with only, I think, 76 of them in support was just an amazing effort by the public over summer holidays. And so I think the RSB so far has been really inspiring for what it's triggered up in terms of, so many diverse communities saying this is not the future we want for our country. I feel like the government's approach has been very disappointing in terms of how they ran that consultation, the lack of actually making any changes after it. They did make some, but not the sort of general gist of what the public wanted. I think they made some perhaps in response to some of the pro submissions. And then, the way that David Seymour in particular, the Minister for Regulation, is not engaging in ideas at all, and undertaking really awful personal attacks. I think, that's incredibly concerning, and disappointing is not a strong enough word, but it also points to, I think, one, the desperation they seem to have to get it through, which is really cognitive dissonance when you hear them going, oh, it's just about transparency. So, yeah, I think the actions speak louder than the words about how important this is to them. But I think the writing off of so much very good, interesting, deeply important thinking as misinformation or groupthink, or the various terms that have been used, is just a really terrible state to see our democracy in. So I think it's both heartening to see the public's depth of engagement and the mass activation around this, but also very concerning to see how the government is responding to that.
Where do we go to from here? What happens next, and what can everyone do?
Yeah, well, from here, the select committee will be analysing the written and oral submissions, and I think their report's due back on the 22nd of September. It was originally November, but within a few days of moving that, the Minister for Regulation asked the select committee to bring it forward, which is interesting. I wonder if he's thinking it might take longer in cabinet than he had perhaps thought it would just get signed off and sail straight through and would be in force on the 1st of January, which they seem quite committed to, presumably so that he can issue the guidance and start making changes next year, and get it bedded in the way he wants it to be bedded in. So with New Zealand First and National both saying they'd like to see changes, we don't know what those are. It's possible it will get quite held up in cabinet, so that could be why the period's shortened. I think people should really be talking to their National and New Zealand First MPs about their concern about this bill, write them letters, and think about how it impacts National and New Zealand First electoral interests or policy platforms, because as I said in my oral submission, this would, this would mean the Act had the primary influence over what policies of National and New Zealand First really make it to the table or into law. And, when you think about it, it's quite ridiculous if that's what National and New Zealand First support is ACT Party policies domineering even more than they do currently, then really, why don't they just close their parties and all join the ACT Party? Because if we're going to, assimilate and make all parties subject to ACT Party policy, then what's the point in having all these different parties? So
you get rid of all the red tape and you just replace it with the pink and yellow ribbons. You brought that up. I love that. I love that term you used.
So they do claim it's getting rid of red tape, and there is a big deregulation agenda here. And of course, regulation keeps us safe. It's not a burden as such. But yeah, it would be replacing it with all this pink and yellow tape of bureaucracy and hurdles that good policy would have to jump through. And the Minister for Regulation will have a big red pen marking irresponsible on all the National and New Zealand First policies that he doesn't like. And so the mind really boggles as to whether they've actually thought that through and the implications for them as ministers or for the backbenchers, where ultimately probably National and New Zealand First would suffer electorally if this gets through and ACT gets a lot more platform and power for their values, which would likely lead to more power for their party, I would imagine. So yeah, I really encourage everyone to take that action.
It seems to me it says a lot about Christopher Luxon's negotiation capability in the MMP side of things. Look, thank you very much for joining us today. That's been very valuable for all of us. It's been very thought-provoking, and it's a big wake-up call, I think, to anybody that's not familiar with any of these dangers, risks and realities that are going on right in front of our noses as we carry on in New Zealand. Thank you so much for all your work. It's massive kudos to you that you've shown so much interest and passion and put so much work into this. I think it's tremendous, the work you've done, and I think on behalf of everybody at G News, we'll give you a standing ovation for all the work you've done. You're really helping us all get our heads around things. So thank you, Melanie, and I hope to talk to you again about the progress on this heinous piece of law, and hopefully we can get rid of it before it gets anywhere near being put into law.
Oh, thanks, Gerard. I really appreciate it, and yeah, so glad it's been helpful to you and your readers and viewers. And yeah, thank you for all the work that you do too. Look forward to talking again soon.
Talk again. See ya.
Bye.
Welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah,